Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 598th New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, the Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Sheena Hoszko, Brett Story, Leslie Topp, and Allison Morehead, with an introduction by Suzanne Hudson. And we're also thrilled to welcome Bianca Rae Messinger here to close today's program. Before we get started, Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we are on Lenapehoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and the Shinnecock Indian Nation. We encourage you to check the chat for a living document of resources and actions. The Brooklyn Rail would like to thank the Terra Foundation for sponsoring our NSC program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive. You can view today's event and our full archive on the Rail's YouTube channel. And now to introduce our fabulous guests and host. Sheena Hoszko is a sculptor and anti-prison organizer. Her art practice examines the power dynamics and violence of geographical, architectural, and psychological sites, informed by her family's experiences with incarceration, the military, and mental illness. Hoszko has exhibited nationally and internationally and was named to the 2021 SOBI long list. She is currently a PhD student in cultural studies at Queen's University in Ontario. And based in Toronto, Brett Story is a filmmaker, writer, and geographer. Her films have screened internationally at multiple festivals, and she has held fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the Sundance Documentary Institute. Brett is the author of the book called Prison Land: Mapping Carceral Power Across Neoliberal America. She also holds a PhD in geography and is an assistant professor in the School of Image Arts at Toronto Metropolitan University. And Leslie Topp is a professor of architectural history and in the Department of History of Art at Birkbeck College and the University of London. Her teaching encompasses art, architecture, design, and urbanism from 1800 to present, with a particular focus on Central Europe around 1900. Our host, Allison Morehead, is Associate Professor of Art History at Queen's University. They specialize in modern art and with interests in French, German, and Scandinavian art of late 19th century. Current projects include the exhibition Edward Munch in Medicine, co-edited volumes entitled Modernisms and Medicines, and a monograph entitled Gambling and the Modern Imaginary. And finally, we have art historian and critic Suzanne Hudson, who has helped curate this series. She is an associate professor of art history and fine arts at the University of Southern California. She writes with special emphasis on the history, theory, and conventions of painting and process. She's also a regular contributor to Art Forum and has penned numerous essays. Her most recent book is Contemporary Painting from Thames and Hudson. And thank you all so much for joining us for a conversation today. And I'm so happy to pass the mic over to you, Allison. Thank you.
Actually, Suzanne, hi, thank you so much, Eleanor. Suzanne, did you want to do an introduction to the series before I launch into just passing over to our presenters?
Sure, of course, I'll jump in really briefly, mostly to say a word of thanks to Chloe and Eleanor and Fong and everyone at the Rail who has helped make this possible, and also to my co-curator of the series, Tanya, Sheehan, who unfortunately was not able to be present with us today. But I also just wanted to share that this is part of an ongoing series that will come to a conclusion in the fall. It's called Looking After on Art and Healing. And we're really grateful for all of you for joining us today to think more specifically about questions of art and health in relation to incarceration. So I think with that, I'll just pass it back to you, Allison, and thank you so much in advance for leading today's event.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. And I'll just add my thanks as well to Chloe, to Eleanor, to all the Brooklyn Rail staff, to Fong, and to our audience members and our presenters, and our poet who will be doing a reading at the end of today's conversation. So I just want to say, just really briefly before our presenters share their work with us, just that this session is born out of a desire to bring conversations about incarceration to the center of conversations about health, and to try to do so through artistic practice, through documentary filmmaking, and through critical art history. So despite all the theoretical and historical work on institutions of incarceration and institutions of medicine as part of a carceral archipelago, I think the social environment society is still very invested in imagining the prison industrial complex as somehow separate from and not, intertwined with the medical industrial complex. And it seems to me that our presenters today, in both subtle and not so subtle ways, offer various pathways to identifying, acknowledging, and analyzing the overlaps, particularly between prison systems and psychiatric systems. But we'll be talking again more broadly about health and social and individual health. So with that, just that brief introduction to the topic today, I'm going to pass over the lead to Sheena, who's going to present her work. And then, so we'll have three presentations, brief presentations of work, and then we'll launch into a conversation followed by a conversation amongst our presenters, and then followed by a Q&A with you, the audience. So Sheena, can I pass it over to you now?
Indeed. Hi all. I'm just setting a timer here because there's lots of speakers and lots to talk about. So I tend to go on, as they say. So I'm coming to you from Montreal to Chagi Mooniyaang, and big thanks to everyone for being here and for organizing. I haven't had a chance to talk about art making in a very long time from an artist perspective, so I'm pretty excited to do that. So I'm going to be sharing about my artist practice, solidarity work with people inside, and my research on art as it relates to prison resistance in so-called Canada, as much as I can in 10 minutes. It's going to be a bit of a constellation approach. So for some context, according to recent figures, approximately 13,000 people are held in federal penitentiaries, 20,000 in provincial prisons, 9,000 in immigration detention centers, 198,000 in long-term care facilities, and 60,000 in foster care settings across so-called Canada. These institutions target and confine Indigenous, Black, people of color, disabled, non-status, and poor people, continuing and strengthening the oppressive systems of colonialism, slavery, white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy that this country I'm in is founded on. Here in Canada, we have a smaller population than the US, and our prison system reflects that. However, the prison as a locus of racial capitalism is in parallel. This year, 50% of the people held in federal women's institutions are Indigenous, and that number jumps to 90% in certain provincial institutions in this country, specifically in the prairies. For intros on prisons and resistance in so-called Canada, I would suggest the zine Under New Management as a starting point, as well as the abolition syllabus, as well as the website for SMAC, for a conversation on Indigenous and Black solidarities in response to the Canadian colonial state. I would recommend the brand new book, Rehearsals for Living by Robin Maynard and Leanne Betta-Samoke Simpson. So I see all those links are in the chat. So I'm gonna not say a lot of things, and I really hope that folks can follow up on that stuff, because I'm reading a lot of those things right now. So I'm wondering if I can go to my first slide, please. Thank you, Eleanor. So I'm a sculptor, first and foremost, whatever that means these days. Oh, the full screen made my notes go away. There we go. And So essentially what I've been doing for a long time is using formal sculptural language, specifically that of post-minimalism, to talk about sites of incarceration in so-called Canada. This project from 2014, what I did is I would visit sites of confinement, in this case, the Immigration Detention Center in Laval. Canada has 3 main immigration detention centers. I walked the perimeter and I translated those measurements into this rented fencing and installed that in the gallery. So essentially, I wanted to use that post-minimal sculptural language to sort of pull people in. And then there's this reveal moment when they're like, what am I looking at? What is this referencing? And at the time, there was less conversation about incarceration and it's like carceral adjacent in a gallery context. And all projects would exist in parallel with like a zine or a flyer that would link to grassroots organizing. So I've been doing this work for a long time, and I think it's important to note that my practice isn't about what it's like to be incarcerated. I've been in prisons, but I'm not incarcerated. The intent of the work is to always be like, how are we implicit in these carceral systems? And I just want to make that clear. That idea of kind of representing incarceration, I don't think that's something for me, obviously, to take on. In parallel with all this work, I'll talk about organizing, art, and all that stuff. The sort of, and maybe this is where healing comes in relationship to art, is my family's own ongoing experiences of criminalization. And so it was very taboo to talk about for a long time, but I feel by doing the artworks in this weirdly public way, it allowed for private conversation with my family, and also sort of realizing too that the criminalization and incarceration that my family has experienced, because they're white, is substantially different than the criminalization and incarceration they would have experienced in this country if they were Indigenous, Black folks of color. So I think those sort of racial hierarchies are very present in the carceral state here in Canada too. This next work that I'm doing, I'll go quickly, this is Prison de la Santé in Paris. I walked around the perimeter, translated that distance into this orange security fencing, wrapped it in the site. This was the site where Foucault did a lot of his organizing. And also it was undergoing this renovation. It's kind of an institution that houses sort of high profile, they call them VIP prisoners. And at the time I was looking at the difference between the Canadian carceral state and the French carceral state. And by this time, this is from 2018, I'd become more involved in anti-prison abolitionist organizing in Montréa, where I am, and also like going into prisons as part of that work. We can go to the next slide. Oh, there we go. This is a work called Correctional Service Canada Accommodation Guidelines Mental Health Care Facility. It's installed in Blackwood Gallery in Toronto. I did an access to information request and I got the design manual for prison renovations in Canada, like this 800 word, like super big tome, and was translating some of these architectures into one-to-one material, one-to-one size, with materials that go back into the world, right? That nothing sort of becomes like an art object to be bought and sold, because that feels like a terrible idea in regards to this context. When thinking, this is a mental health care facility, so a treatment room and a waiting room. Obviously, mental health care in the context of a prison is a bit of a joke, as I think most of us understand. But I did wanted to share that in 2016, a study of people who had spent time in Ontario provincial institutions found that life expectancy decreased by 4.2 years for men and 10.6 years for women compared with the general population. So that's substantial. So like we talked about different types of death in prison, social death, biological death, civil death, but also, you know, just life expectancy as soon as you're in conflict with the prison system automatically decreases. And so while prisons do produce biological, social, and civil death, it's important to remember prisoners have always found a way to live in community and to live inside. And sort of in the links that I put in here, I'd encourage you to read Briar Patch's The Prison Abolition issue, as well as go through the Penal Press archives for words and art about community, struggle, resistance, and liberation. So we can go to the next slide. This work was done just as the pandemic hit at the Musée d'Art Contemporain in Montreal. And it's this structure, 130 of these go around the Immigration Detention Center. And I was using it, there's an accompanying poster that maps the carceral sites near Montreal, because there's about 5 joints that are all within a 2-kilometer area. So X amount of these to the women's provincial joint, X amount of these to the men's federal joint, just as a way of sort of affecting the audience on a physical level, trying to think of these sites with their bodies. What is the potential of art in that context? It's something I'd like to think about. COVID, oh, we can go back one more time. Since the onset of COVID-19, the conditions inside prisons have become much worse. Many people continue to face severe isolation and unsanitary conditions within ongoing lockdown conditions. Though governments have decided the pandemic is over on the outside, prisoners often remain locked up and with seriously limited access to prison libraries, gyms, or outside relationships. In addition, the pod or cohort system that were put in place during the pandemic for health reasons, as opposed to decarceration, are still in place and will likely remain. The institutions are using the pandemic lockdown conditions to increase surveillance and isolation and further keep prisoners isolated from folks inside and out, quelling both physical and mental health, as well as the possibility of building power and resistance inside the institutions. You can go to the next slide. This is my second to last one, going super fast here. But this is the most recent work I did. It's up at the Biennale Nationale de Sculpture. I went back to school, have been reading a lot of Ruthie Wilson Gilmore. Some folks on this panel may be familiar with her work, and in the audience, amazing abolitionist and scholar, geographer. I've been thinking a lot and looking a lot at ways people have resisted inside prisons in so-called Canada. And Gilmore's work with regards to like life-affirming institutions. You know, abolition isn't just about tearing things down, it's about building new things. I've been looking to work by people like Peter Collins, Corey Cardinal, and asking myself, what can art do inside? And to be honest, I didn't feel actually putting something into the conversation that answered that question just yet, but we could talk through. But I think the one thing that's come up with regards to my own research and then just organizing work, that all prison resistance, the large majority of resistance movements inside have to be in tandem with folks on the outside because of the isolating mechanisms of the prison system. So I think right now we're in a context where things are getting substantially worse inside at a very rapid pace. So we need those stronger movements and we need folks on the outside in contact with folks inside and to step up for that. And I'll move to the last slide. This is just my last slide. Every year in Laval, this site I've been talking about, we go out and we set off fireworks to let folks know we're out there. We know they're in there. It's a whole party time. And just this image means a lot to me. And I also wanted to say that August 10th in Canada and starting internationally is Prisoners' Justice Day. And it's a day when folks don't eat and don't work inside and out, in solidarity with folks who've died inside and with the movement for prisoner resistance and abolition and ending this big mess in general. So keep your eyes out. There should be stuff happening online and maybe close to where you are. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheena. I think we could have heard a lot more and hopefully we will hear a lot more during the conversation. Brett, I'm going to turn it over to you now, okay?
Great, thanks, Sheena. So nice to see even documentation of the work, which looks amazing. Thanks to everyone who helped organize this event. Thank you to Brooklyn Rail for hosting it. It's such an important and ongoing conversation. And I'll admit, when I first got the invitation, I was like, oh, my work isn't really about health and healing per se. And then I started to think about it a little bit more, and I realized that actually, you know, insofar as my work is about incarceration and the carceral system as a system connected and indivisible from other structures of power that organize everyday life, like housing, like education, like the labor market, then it is about health, because health itself is socially determined and healing is also not just a matter of the body and of the mind, but about being in a social world and how the resources are spent and on what kinds of social infrastructure. So just to say a little bit about me, I'm a geographer and a filmmaker primarily. I've been working as an activist and as a scholar and as a filmmaker on prison issues for almost 20 years, but also been working on other kinds of organizing campaigns. I got my start as an anti-poverty organizer working on housing. And I'll just also say that I don't myself have direct experiences with incarceration, but I came to anti-poverty organizing out of my own experiences with poverty and with housing insecurity. And so as a young person starting to be an activist and interested in thinking about and fighting against housing insecurity, that I quickly learned how inextricable that is from questions of policing, especially policing of urban space, and therefore also criminalization and incarceration. So that was my entry point into thinking about and doing work around the prison system. As well as writing, as I said, I'm a filmmaker, which is to say, I think of myself sometimes as an artist. And my films, even while they're described as documentaries, they're working in a mode that I think proposes that that art is necessary for consciousness and art is necessary for connection. And I make my films not to necessarily even say something or to educate, but as a pretext for connection. And I think a lot about, and Sheena, you mentioned this as well, I think a lot about the prison system as, among other things, fundamentally designed to break people via the architecture of isolation. Break communities, destroy communities, and disconnect people from the loved ones and the resources that would enable them. And that enables all of us to be and to thrive in the world. So I made a film in 2016 called The Prison in 12 Landscapes. And the conceit of that film is that it's a film about the prison system in which you never see a prison. Instead, you're taken on a journey across 12 discrete landscapes that maybe at first glance seem like they don't have anything to do with the prison system or the criminal legal system, but in fact offer a way of thinking about how that as a system, as I said, is inextricable from other ways and other structures of power. So there's scenes that are about the labor market, and scenes about gentrification, and scenes about scenes that in many other ways demonstrate how the structure of modern capitalism produces not just the fact of mass incarceration and the necessity of mass incarceration in order to function and to enshrine social inequality in the terms that it does, but that therefore there are a lot of different entry points into fighting against it and being, all of us being prison abolitionists. So I'm going to share a short scene from this film. It's a 5-minute scene. And again, at first glance, I think it's not going to seem directly about healing and health, but it is. I think that this is my invitation, and my entry into this conversation is to suggest that it is very much about healing and health insofar as it's about the question of labor and prison labor. It's about climate change. It's about self-worth and social contact. And I think the scene will be self-explanatory, but basically it takes place on the voice you hear is of a prisoner confined in California who's been sent out as a firefighter to fight one of the numerous wildfires that's been raging on the California coast for many, many years. And this is a common practice in California and elsewhere, that prisoners are deployed as firefighters. So I think we can show that scene now.
Go ahead, you gonna ask me another question or you want me to just keep going? Okay, sure, I'm gonna take my time. My first day here, when I first got to camp, I got thrown on a fire. We had just got through orientation and the horn went off. And I got thrown on the bus and off we went, chasing the smoke. We're driving up the mountain and seeing dirty burn everywhere. All of a sudden, there's a 40-foot wall of flame on both sides of me. Firefighting. I mean, there's no explaining it. It's wild. Trees get so hot and huge, and then they just blow up. You're right in front of the flames, and you can't even look directly at them because they're burning you. You have to fight them from the side. We'll hike for probably 2 to 3 hours to get into a fire area, into our zone. That's a lot of hiking straight up mountains. People are surprised to see us out fighting fires. You guys are an all-woman crew? We're like, yeah. They don't expect that kind of strength from us. At around 2 o'clock in the morning, we'll do what they call a fire watch. We watch the flames and the embers come down. That part is really beautiful. We just watch all the red embers coming down against the night sky like little rockets. You're in the pitch dark. Bugs are everywhere. There's mice crawling by you, the smell of smoke, the smell of the fire. It's hard work, but when we get it done, it's like, wow, we did that. I love the scenery. You're not closed in. You're surrounded by redwood forests. It's like trying to compare being in a box and being in an airplane. You know what I mean? And let's face it, without fire camps, California's fire would just burn. The only way you would tell that I was a prison firefighter is if I told you. On the line, you wouldn't know at all. When you drive out in the vehicle and it says fire crew on it, they all wave at you. We've saved a lot of homes. Sometimes they try to talk to us, but we can't talk back. We'll get in trouble for it. I think of myself as a hero, and sometimes I can tell that the public does too. Who knows what's going to happen when we get out? We've already got one strike against us because of the felony on the application. If everybody paroled here with at least a chance to be a firefighter, then that would be something. But that's not what happens. 9 times out of 10, you're not going to be a firefighter.
So I think that's enough for me, and looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brett. It's hard to imagine you could have picked a more powerful 5 minutes, although I know you could have. I mean, there are so many in your work. Thank you so much. We'll turn it to Leslie now.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks, Allison, and thanks everyone for the invitation to participate. So my work is historical, and what I'm going to bring is a historical take and perhaps a different take on art's role in this kind of triad of art, healing, and incarceration. I work on incarceration's histories, and specifically the histories of the architectures that have been devised to incarcerate people. My chronological framework is kind of the long 19th century, and I'm very interested in working across different institutional types. So the bulk of my work so far has been on psychiatric institutions, but more recently I've been working as well on prisons and the relationship between psychiatric institutions and prisons, and I have a strong interest in workhouses and other types of institutions as well. One thing I thought would be interesting to bring to the conversation is the fact that health and issues of healthfulness and hygiene were really central to that early moment of the late 18th, early 19th century prison reform and institutional reform in general. And that seems odd to think of, but I think it's interesting to reflect on that for instance, John Howard, a key prison reformer, had health absolutely at the center of what he was interested in. So he saw people suffering from jail fever when people were crowded together in old style prisons and infecting each other. He wanted to design prisons that would control infectious diseases. That was a key phenomenon, or a key motivator. But of course, that sense that prisons could be somehow healthful places, or more healthful than what had come before, was always in very direct tension with the other imperatives behind incarcerating people, such as punishment, of course, also controlling prison populations. And another one that's often not talked about is austerity, what I'd call austerity, meaning that the idea that in a public institution, you can't be seen to be living a life that is somehow more comfortable and more well supported and more well nourished than one that you would be living outside of the institution. It's kind of a key component of capitalist liberal ideology of not having the state support people in a better state than how they could support themselves. And of course, that's overall under an overall umbrella of the deprivation of liberty in institutions, and what Brett mentioned, that breaking of ties between families and prisoners, breaking of and interrupting of life trajectories. So you've got the incarceration, you've got the health and the things that militate against that. How then does art enter the equation in my work? And maybe we could have the slides now, please, Eleanor. So I want to bring you an example of this. I thought I'd look at this through a couple of kind of key examples, or maybe one if that's all we have time for. And this is an example really of someone who saw himself as an artist, but was an architect artist, and like lots of architects, possibly still now, find themselves implicated in the system. And so unlike the work of Sheena and Brett that we've just been looking at, here we have someone that is designing prisons, that is in fact an absolutely key component to setting up the whole system right in its early phases. He's self-fashioning himself here in this portrait as a kind of member of the artistic elite. He's young and good looking and fashionable. He's got a friend of his painting his portrait. He's posing with a volume about the Greek revival, which would have been a key text for him and his buddies at the time. And then he's also posing with designs for the project that would really make his name, which was the Eastern State Penitentiary on the outskirts of Philadelphia. You can still go and visit it there. It's open as a museum. There was certainly a strong hygienic impulse between the designs that he created for that prison, but they were indivisible from the idea that the prison would also not only prevent physical contagion, but moral contagion. And in order to do that, famously, it imposed strict solitary confinement on every single prisoner in there for their entire sentence. And it's worth reminding ourselves that those sentences were often for crimes that seem that would never incur solitary confinement now. Things like stealing a horse or minor kind of burglary. So that in the prison, prisoners were cut off from both past and present connections and from any connections with each other within the institution, although they did try to subvert that in various ways. And there was this caused, as one can imagine, and as we've already heard, huge amounts of mental suffering and mental breakdown. People were very much aware when the prison was designed that to keep people in solitary confinement in that permanent kind of way was extremely destructive of mental health. And yet they were so committed to the idea that they went ahead with it anyway. The architect here, the architect-artist, puts himself in the role and is in a way given the role by his patrons of a kind of doctor for social ills, someone that is adopting this almost medical persona in order to control what is seen as the sources of the disease in the so-called lower orders, in deviance, in poverty, really. And so we can see Hal's portrait here, and thanks for going ahead. Yeah, there's a couple of slides here showing you the penitentiary itself. If you want to flip through the next one as well. Thanks. It's an image of the corridor with all the individual cells, and the next one, Eleanor, shows a recreation of an individual cell where you really get that strong sense of both the isolation and the sense of austerity. And then I think I've put in the next slide is going back to the portrait. And we can think of that portrait as a kind of art washing, if you want to call it that, as a kind of adopting the prestige of art and the high-mindedness of art to gloss over what's going on in the structure that Haviland designed and that Haviland was so crucial in promoting, and letting his own prestige too, and prestige of his profession. And the portrait, of course, has ended up in the Met, and this little description here, it really pulls all its punches in terms of not really addressing what was at stake in the design that he produced. So I think for time's sake, I'm going to leave it there, and we can go back. Yeah, we can look at this example later if we have time in the discussion.
Thank you so much, Leslie. And again, thank you to everybody, to our presenters for just giving us a real taste of your work. So we have a few minutes to sort of have a conversation among the presenters. And then, as I say, we can open it up to Q&A. And I'll just start by asking, the broadest of questions, which was already actually mentioned in some of your preambles. So it's really an invitation to say more about that. I wanted to simply, say, this is a series that centers sort of the optimistic terms of health and healing. And so I wanted to just ask, what, if any, role does healing or does a movement towards something called health have in your practice. And I want to suggest that we might think of this either as healing as potential outcome, that might be one role one might hope for, or of course, healing and health as an object of analysis or critique. And I might invite you to think about that actually specifically in relation to bodies in landscapes. Because it seems to me that this is something that bodies in landscapes and spaces in and out, right? Because that's something that certainly links all of your works, I think, in really interesting ways. So I'll just invite you to say more about what you already sort of introduced in your talks.
Maybe I'll just start with a couple of thoughts. I mean, maybe I'll say just to begin, anyone who has spent time in prison or has known people who've spent time in prison, I'm sure has encountered how prevalent art is. I mean, so many prisoners are artists and or become artists inside, broadly defined with whatever tools are available to them. And the remarkable thing about that, I mean, there's so many remarkable things about that, including the sort of ingenuity with which, things are transformed into instruments, dyes from M&Ms are turned into paint, the kinds of beautiful sculpture that gets made by incarcerated people. But for me, part of what struck me in talking to people who make art inside is a sort of fundamental sense of recognition in terms of the role that art plays in my own being. I feel like it's always really important for me to say about being a filmmaker, like there's a selfish component to it. So it's not, it's not a sort of noble thing of like, I'm making these films because they need to be in the world because other people need to see them. I think it's important to admit that I make art as a way to bear the world, as a person who's in this world and who finds in some ways acute and in some ways at a more sort of distant register, the multiple violences of living in this world totally intolerable. And so I think of myself as making art as a kind of ongoing strategy against depression, and the political project starts from there, because a depressed person cannot be politically active, or at least I, as a depressed, when I'm depressed, when you think about that as a sort of as a kind of unwellness, cannot be the agent for change and transformation that I want to be and that I want the people around me to be able to be. And so I think that there's just a recognition there that, again, and I think this connects to the way in which the prison system has, from its very origins, as Leslie has described, been predicated on isolation, because actually social bodies sharing space is a threat to the social order. It always has been. This is why prisons are such sites of resistance. This is why the sort of contagion effect is not just a contagion of germs, but a contagion of social energy, right? It's why, public forms of corporeal punishment that used to happen in public spaces that were visible to others were counter-effective in that they incited people to understand the violence of the state, and state punishment had to be taken inside behind closed walls. There's the social order as it is that does so much harm to so many people requires a fundamental and multiple levels and scales of people being removed from each other. And I do really believe that art practice is like political practice. And I think art practice and political practice actually have a lot in common with each other. They're not just antidotes to the way in we can mentally internalize the harms of the world, and the sort of messages of our own self-worth, lack of self-worth and disposability, but also connect to others, see ourselves as belonging to something called a commons or something called a society or something understood as social. And I think that that's, yeah, for me, that's really sort of key to thinking about, thinking about that alongside then a set of questions around how we need to think also of prisons as a social infrastructure and as spaces that get produced out of resources that are in fact our resources, taxpayers, and thinking about how the sort of waste of social resources to produce this infrastructure of harm, rather than deploying all of those resources to, all the kinds of infrastructures that are necessary for health. I mean, actual hospitals, actual free health accessible addiction treatment centers, mental health crisis centers. I mean, think about how all of that money could be used to build sort of infrastructures for well-being on all fronts, sort of physical, mental, everything. So there's a way in which just by existing, I think prisons are a form of harm, and they are also a deployment of the resources that are necessary actually to make possible healthy people. Sorry, that was a long comment.
No, thanks, Brett. Sheena or Leslie?
I could chime
Sheena, go
in.
ahead.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Brett. All of that. That was great. And it was great to see your film, that excerpt as well. It's been a while, and feels even more prescient now to see that clip. So thank you for sharing. I mean, a couple of small tangents. As a question to the group, I don't know if everyone in the conversation or a large amount of folks in the audience are in New York, but just wondering if folks saw the Marking Time exhibition at the MoMA. I don't know if it's able to put a link to the show in the chat, which was sort of a exhibition of art by folks made inside. And I think that when we think of like, what can art be, what can art do inside, I really like to think about what does it also mean for that work to move into, say, a museum context. What does that do for the artist? What does that do to the conversation of incarceration? Part of the reason of going back to school is like reading Fleetwood's book and just, using art as kind of like the lens in which to look at incarceration. So that's more of a question for the group. Did you see the show? What did you think? How does that relate to questions of health in this context? Similar as an artist, I think art, it kind of operates in a level that's not necessarily of language. It's doing something different. I think it can translate experiences and feelings that in a way that I think is super imperative, especially right now. So I think inside and out, that's what people use it for. And that is, for me, an intrinsic to this idea of being healthy. Within a carceral context, say in Canada, there's like a really big history of co-optation of art making and cultural practices by the prison system. So I think we also have to be wary of that as well. For example, Canada runs healing lodges for Indigenous prisoners that are essentially, sort of institutes and, put into a carceral context Indigenous healing practices and Indigenous art making as part of a punishment. So I think we also, need to think of how the system itself will grab on to art making and try to claim it as its own. And I think as far as my own work and practice goes, this idea of health, I feel the prison is the opposite of health. So that's how I'll sort of frame that. And I do a lot of work that's anti-prison stuff and on a lot of different registers. So for me, prison is this act of driving people towards death. So for me, that's what health would be the opposite of that. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Sheena.
Yeah, shall I respond to that a bit? That I think that just thinking about making art within institutions, that was in a way what I was going to discuss if I'd gone on to that second example. That it's interesting to think about that in spatial terms. So what kind of structures or contexts for art making are afforded by the institutional spaces? And in what ways is the art making an effort to to find some space that is not an institutional space? I think that the example of the capture context is the whole issue of art in the asylum, right, which has this long history in itself, or that has a long historiography going back to the 1920s and 30s, where and earlier than that, as Allison has investigated, where psychiatrists were collecting art made by patients, and then artists start becoming very interested in that. And so Jean Dubuffet is an example of this, and his development of the notion of art brut. And the asylum then becomes a kind of pure space of art making, where you can be guaranteed that the people there have not been exposed to the stultifying conventions of the art world, and therefore their art is going to come from this raw and pure place. What that misses out entirely is the kind of conventions and the structuring that's going on within the asylum, and the way that it is a highly constructed space. And so, for instance, in early 20th century asylums, you have huge dormitory spaces where people have no individual space to their own, and art making becomes very, very difficult in that kind of scenario. And so people seek out spaces or are given spaces within the institution to do that. And what I think what we have to keep in mind is that there's that tension going on, that there's always that thing that they're in a way, the art making is a critique of the lack of space for art making and the lack of freedom around art making within the institution.
Leslie, I'm glad you brought up that longer history. I was really thinking about that in relation to sort of Sheena's questions about, and insistences in your own art practice, Sheena, about like where the materials go after they go through the museum. And also just, the fact that, and Brett's point about this being, part of the larger, Brett and everybody's point about this being part of the larger structures of racial capitalism, right? Where inevitably there's going to be this kind of co-optation of art produced within institutions, carceral institutions, psychiatric institutions, et cetera, that then becomes like mobilized to, for all sorts of capitalist purposes outside the institution, for the art market, for, a market that is looking for the next new hot thing, that's looking for a pure kind of experience. If I can maybe just sort of pose one more question, I sort of threw it out a little bit in the last question, but I was really struck by, and it's sort of a leitmotif, but I think it's an incredibly powerful one. Of course, Sheena, you showed the image of the fireworks at the end and sort of, mentioned this as an act of resistance, as an act of solidarity, as an act of connection. And Brett, of course, that resonated very powerfully with your choice of clip of, this incredibly complex act of being forced to fight a fire and yet also participating in the narratives of heroism around that, but at, really, horrible, costs. And I guess I wanted to also then connect that with that kind of imperial gaze that seems to be suggested, Leslie, by, the portrait that you talked about so much and the landscape in the background. So to just ask you to say more, all three of you, maybe about landscapes as places of, of harm and healing, right? Like the ways in which, incarcerated folks bring the incarceration with them, right? And resist against it, whether they're in an actual, in an actual building or not, right? To just say more about landscape and healing, or the resistance to the incarcerated space.
I could just jump in on that briefly and say that it's very interesting to think about different institutions' relationship between indoor space and outdoor space, basically, and whether there's any connection between them or not. So prison architecture goes to huge lengths to cut people off from outdoor space, even when they have actually purpose-built, courts or areas or yards where people can go outside. So in the 19th century prison, and Kingston Penitentiary is an example of this in Kingston, Ontario, and lots of different examples. You basically eradicate nature, build a big wall, and then build the structure in that. You also design cells in such a way that there is no view of the outside whatsoever. And that's part of the punitive environment, is that you never enjoy a view of this. You might see the sky if you're lucky, but that sense of that we take for granted of being in a room and being able to look out of that room into something else beyond the room is taken away. In the asylum, on the other hand, there's a lot of effort put into creating that connection. In fact, there are lots of other problematic things around how the landscape is used there, but it's just interesting to think of contrasting approaches to that within institutions.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just add to that. I mean, when we talk about solitary confinement, we're obviously talking about social deprivation, but we're also talking about sensory deprivation, right? And so one of the things people I've interviewed have talked about is, especially political prisoners who were put into solitary confinement, is like a form of called a form of blindness that occurs by seeing just only white. So it's like you're not just removed from like the landscape outside, but like any kind of variegation in like what you see. And so the way in which that breaks down even the possibility of selfhood. I mean, it tells us a couple of things. It tells us what we need in order to be people, right? We need access to each other, and we need access to a sense of contrasting colors, sky, life in various forms. But I think the other way that I'm thinking about landscape as a geographer is in terms of it always being reminded that space is socially determined. And so one of the things that is so interesting about talking to people who've been part of these fire camps is the way in which being part of a carceral institution and the sort of codes around that and the experiences of that differ, and in some ways stay the same when they're on the fire camp, or whether they're in the cell block, and in many ways change. So, again, many of those people, myself included, who are critical of forced labor inside, might look at something like a fire camp and say, oh, that's a terrible thing to do to people, force them to perform this backbreaking, dangerous labor for literally $1.50 a day. And yet, if you actually talk to anyone who's who has the opportunity to work in a fire camp, 99% of them will say they'd rather do that than be in their cell block. So it has to do with the kinds of things we heard the woman in that scene describe, like a kind of relationship to oneself that becomes possible when you see the sky, a relationship, access to, again, maybe it's like a wrong kind of investment, but to get to occupy for a moment the status of the hero as opposed to the status of the criminal. Like those are sort of diametrically opposed, but both are socially constructed, and they're socially constructed in space, right? So a person put in the space of the prison, that space helps produce this class of human being we call a criminal. Just like the space of the fire truck or the fire produces this class of human being that we call the hero. And when that one actual person occupies both roles, there's a whiplash, but I think it's an important whiplash because it's, again, a reminder that those identities are constructed just as those landscapes are constructed. And insofar as they're constructed, we can change them, right? Like this is also what we see happening with prison resistance, is a reminder that the state wants that space to mean and be one thing, and people who are actually occupying that space are determined to make and transform it into something else.
Totally. Yes, Brett. I always say that sculptors are like wannabe geographers. We're like space, material, place. But that idea of space is socially determined. for me is really important too, with this idea of the landscape, the image I had of the New Year's Eve demos that happen every year. And it is so much about showing up. I think a lot of the resistance and solidarity work, like the work I do is about showing up every week or every 2 weeks to a certain place at a certain time and talking to people, And I think especially like COVID space as it's produced has put us all, not unlike, within a carceral context, in these siloed spaces where it's easy not to show up. Obviously that's determined by a ton of different things, how you move, how you cannot move. But I think for me, when I think of the landscape and I think of carceral resistance, I think of the idea of showing up like physically or emotionally and things like that. And for me, that can kind of disrupt the logics, the carceral logics of being there in some ways. So I just wanted to put that into the idea of landscape.
Thanks so much. I know, so this is a good time. If anybody has any questions to put in the Q&A, please go ahead. But I think Eleanor from the Rail has a question.
Yeah, thank you, Allison. And thank you so much to the amazing panelists. It's been such a great conversation. I wanted to ask, I guess this is sort of for Brett and Sheena, but I think anyone can really jump in. My question was prompted during Brett's presentation. I was wondering if you were familiar with an organization called the Poor People's Press that's kind of based in the West Coast or Midwest area in the US.
I'm not, no. So
cool.
Say more.
Yeah. I'm sorry. You're not either. Okay, cool. Cool. Well, yeah, I'll definitely put some links there, but their kind of movement and organization is kind of, they're structured around being poor people based or poor people run and Indigenous people run. And I'm going to find the some links to put in the chat because they've done some really cool work, and they have also self-published a book about it. So I was wondering, I guess, just more broadly, how their how their practice of being led by those who are, I guess, most directly affected can be or should be like inspiration for any abolition work or any anti-prison work, any prison activism. I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Totally, 100%. I think I didn't know about this org, so thanks for sharing. I'm gonna share something right now. I'm gonna hype my day job, but I think, for the aforementioned reasons, organizing with folks inside who are currently incarcerated can be challenging because of communication issues. So it does definitely require a different understanding of time and pace that I think can be challenging for folks on the outside. So if you're getting involved into anti-prison organizing and taking the lead from folks inside, it's gonna go a lot slower than Instagram chat. That's one thing I'd say. And that's something that I think can be a challenge. I work at this organization called Rittenhouse A New Vision, which is so-called Canada's oldest abolitionist organization, in the sense that it's been doing grassroots abolitionist work since the 90s in so-called Canada, founded by Ruth Morris, and it's led by folks with lived experience of incarceration, and does a multiplicity of different programs. But I think definitely with the surge of, sort of interest in abolitionist work, I think it's important to look to organizations who've been doing work for a long time and sort of follow the lead of folks who've been doing the work. And when starting sort of new initiatives, making sure you're sort of plugging into spaces that, definitely follow the lead of folks incarcerated, and if not, follow their lead in concert if communication is slow. So I just wanted to say that. Yeah,
maybe I'll just add to that. I mean, I I both totally agree. And I also think that there can be a way in which the desire to center people who are directly affected can also become inadvertently a pretext to disengage for those people who think that they're not directly impacted. And I actually think the invitation is to think about how we're all directly impacted in one way or another, and to think about what solidarity work is, how solidarity work is also liberation work for all of us. I mean, that's not only because identities are complex. Like I, for example, was a poor homeless kid who's now a university professor who's very middle class. So identities are complicated, but also we just need that for actual change to happen. The investment needs to be in things to change, right? Like it's just not good enough to say, like, to remain small as movements, because the forces against us are too powerful. And so I really do believe that centering directly affected people is the best way to remain accountable to actual campaigns and activities that are going to be meaningfully beneficial to people, but also that shouldn't be a pretext to not be involved, and that there's lots of ways to be involved, to be in solidarity, to be in coalition, to be internationalist in our efforts, and to think also about again how something like the prison system, and again just to invoke Ruth Wilson Gilmore, is not just something over there that happens to other people, but is a set of relationships that we're all invested in, and thinking about race in those terms as well. Like, you know, I think a lot about like what it means to think about whiteness right now. And I'm less interested in just sort of self-flagellating as a white person, and more interested in thinking about like, what is the relationship between whiteness and police? What is the relationship between whiteness and gentrification? What is the relationship or property relations? So how can I disinvest from these systems that uphold white supremacy rather than just self-identify and step back, right? So that's just a sort of my addition to Sheena's comments that I totally agree with.
Same, Brett. It's like if folks, it can also be like, how could I say it? I know we don't have a lot of time, but following folks with lived experience, specifically of incarceration, also can put people into a position they don't necessarily want to be in either, right? So it's like, when working locally and really starting there and what's happening, and following sort of like existing initiatives, and how can you help those build?
These latest comments really call to mind sort of another role that art is often called to play, which is to say not only the role of kind of therapeutic form of healing, but also, or critique, but also as a form of commemoration and memorialization. And I'm wondering if, you know, maybe in just our last minute or so, anybody has thoughts about, you know, and I know Leslie's done a little bit of work with sort of thinking about, you know, how do some of these carceral spaces, once they are depurposed, get reused, if they should be reused. But, you know, for all three of you, like, what are the potential roles for art in memory making, in history making, in sort of preserving some kind of trace maybe of activisms within, on the inside, but also, like, you know, moving those out?
Yeah, I mean, not as an artist myself, but I would have thought that art is absolutely crucial in opening up a kind of critical space between, a critical space within which to think, what do we do with these spaces, rather than so depressingly often the immediate option is tourism, redevelopment, and which often, especially the redevelopment option, in the case of in Britain, many former psychiatric structures, just means erasure, you know, name change, function change, and let's just forget as quickly as possible what it used to be. So it seems to me art has to be there to help us, or to, as I say, open up that critical space.
I guess for myself, you know, just as we think of art making on the outside, especially in context of this conversation, as a pretty expansive thing, performative, dematerialized cinema, film, sound. I feel when we think of art on the inside of prisons or art in relationship to prisons, we get quite narrow in our definitions of what art can be or what art is and how things should be remembered. And I think that just comes out of the history of like monument making and memorial making that has like a pretty entrenched state history. I'm just going to put one image in the chat. This is, I don't know if it'll come up for folks. It's a banner that was dropped during one of the Kingston pen riots, and it says "Under New Management." It's just a banner that's being held. And for me, I'm like, that is like one of the best artworks I've ever seen in my life, if we're going to talk about art, you know? So I think for myself, the role of art, I think, is to be this thing that's continually like trying to expand, you know, how we see, feel, understand. And I think we need to be a bit more critical, as most, you know, which is the ongoing thing in thinking through monument and memorial and like what it is and what it can be.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, I think art is often what the, you know, what the marginalized have to demonstrate that we are there, right? That they were there, that we were there. It's like, again, thinking about, I mean, and that's why it's really important for them to be recognized as historical documents of the complex lives that often were subject to all sorts of colonial state forms of violence. We have plenty of official records of what the state, what powerful entities do to others, and to you know, art is one of the weapons of the dispossessed, among other things. Say we were here, we did not go quietly.
Thank you all. I know I think I want to hand it back over to Eleanor now to introduce our poet.
Yeah, thank you so much for addressing that question. It was really amazing to hear. And just thank you again to Allison for facilitating, to our panelists, Sheena, Leslie, and Brett, to Suzanne, and also Tanya, who wasn't able to be here today, for curating this series. And thank you to the audience for joining us. It's been a really, really great conversation this afternoon. And we do, as many of you know, have a tradition of ending our events with a poetry reading. So I'm thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Bianca Rae Messinger, to the stage. Bianca is a poet and translator living in Buffalo, New York. She's the author of the long poem, "The Land Was Thee There," and the chapbook, "The Love of God." And her chapbook, "Parallel Bars," was the winner of the 2021 Center for Book Arts Chapbook Prize. Her translations of South American authors have been published for the Berlin Biennale, Monster House Press, and others. And she also writes for Ramona in Buenos Aires. And thank you for joining us to read, Bianca. Please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eleanor, and thank you everyone for this extremely important discussion. And it's always a strange to talk about art as a theoretical response and practical response, and then have to actually get up and read it. So I'm hoping this works out. But thank you again for everything. So I'm going to read from a long poem. It's called "The Ravishing of a Field." It includes texts from Inhugenian and her book "My Life," and Pierre Klosowski's "Monet Vivant," and then a short poem at the end. So, and it starts with a quote from Inhugenian. Can you hear me okay? I didn't say that. Yes? Okay. Try to speak into the mic.
Yeah, that's a little better. It was a little bit choppy, but.
Okay. A spiral is the shape of a progression of circles. Thus, myopia may serve to dispel the pains of chronophobia. And then in that gray field, some smallness becomes focus, becomes two men in yellow vests. It resembles little, but feels like this conflagration. because a balance is created, but not in representation. Soften the cars so they're either green or red. Is that what it feels like sometimes? Not optics, but a quickening of the spirit, or mooring, as such some warmth, a pool of it. When does memory become so sedentary, thus to avoid its hair gripping when we move inward, move into time? We couch memory in time. This is it. Do we know each other now that we're on the beach, where the rocks are and where the rats run under them? So that memory looks like what it feels, not that exact signaling, but some formation without regret. To get to a point where it is not returning, but recombining, which is what it is, not a progression. Maybe being myopic is being what the shape of a lamp feels like, or the timber of a sunset, or the crease in a back as you slide your arm across it. Time so that it includes. Wondering how a you connects onwards. Needing to touch a fountain in Paris and never having been, and needing to, and needing it to happen quickly. But you were always more wary than me, except for what was necessary, slow and profound as it makes an echo. He says that one has no value, only two, afraid, smoking outdoors, so much space to be filled. Everything here was in the value of idea, a last visit before it's just getting out with itself. Visit before she's gone. I will wake up there, won't I? Type it out, then stop, creating a recording of its intimacy. Either each red strand trapped in an orange tube, and it wasn't to do with her fear of control, but wanting it deeply and unattachable simultaneously, which surprised me. But instead came the feeling of a looming back at progress. Look at their own space, dotted, crossed like that. More, she wanted to be in the habit of it, in its neighbor, and in the time of thinking it, of a roundabout, of wanting to come, needing it actually, all a nuisance, not painful exactly, using it to get across, coming and the making of the marking she makes on your leg of its making, what at that point felt small, a step lighter as she looks to the source of its movement, beginning. That night where it's very windy, the motion is exchanged at eve time, the buildings swaying between the streets, fantasy becoming an elementary fabrication with an animentary definition of price, under whose non-diegetic constraint is not exclusively maintained. We begin from the diegetic perspective of objects in order to examine the struggle of the feelings against their inadequate form. In the everyday regime, then, the affects have been materially reconfigured into a mere demand for goods, which is a painful inversion of their very being. The bars, then, at the entrance to an open box with the lights in the background. We, in our crossing, have to run towards some point back. We make ourselves stop moving there, following as a circle instead of its opposite, coming out of the floor and again in keyholes or adjustments, losing sight of desire and then returning to the past. Small openings or maneuvers like hissing or bubbles. We alone can glimpse their style. And this last poem is shorter, and it's called The Gospel According to Matthew, for Stacey Samazik. He starts again, watching what concerns next, then finding it where you were and where the party starts, going somewhere we need. It being a smell thing and going back tomorrow at it with the feeling of living, of what's needed somewhere else. He's known it from a decade of collecting frames, only he didn't force it into feeling or didn't try to. That instinct comes back accidentally. Yeah, thanks to things being polyvocal when they don't know what else they are. He asks what she's reading. She's listening to the fish jump. I was able to say what tools I used in my process, and it makes me want to get caught, but never do. I will tell you of the heavens, not of meditation or giving credit where the unrespected machines go. Two boys of the same vine, only one comes to the public, and one goes the other way, saying it's the will of the Father. It being a small thing and saying to let it take its time, like an anecdote. Then taking a second to focus on his glasses and his stupid top body, unable to see an escape or the prefect either. She was too busy trying to be unworked, having given up on coming, and instead asks what it sounds like to be this close to God, looking at portions of the street instead, its main charm being a change in heart rate when the music builds. Thank you so much for having me.
Amazing poems, amazing reading. Thank you so much, Bianca. And thank you so much to our panelists again. And thank you to the audience for joining us. Shout out to Suzanne and Tanya for helping to curate this series. Please join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. to kick off our art and technology series with Nancy Baker Cahill, Jean Cooney, Joan Jonas, Kilo Quiche, and Lajun McMillan, as well as Charlotte Kent. We will conclude with a poetry reading by Maxine Chernoff. And over the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has brought together art, music, dance, film, theater, literature, and social and political meditations in our monthly public events, or our monthly publication and our daily public events, like our NSC here. So please check the chat for a link to donate and help support our operations and writers and editors here at the Rail. And thank you once again to our panel. It's been an amazing conversation today. You should now go ahead and turn on your mics to say hello and goodbye as you leave. Great to see you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Allison, Sheena,
Thank you, Sheena.
Leslie, Suzanne,
Thank you,
Tanya, Brett.
Suzanne.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the conversation and thank you for the reading, Bianca.
Thank you for the beautiful reading, Bianca.
Thank you for the beautiful reading, Bianca.
Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you, Allison.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Bianca.
Bye, everyone.